Hi, I'm Sarah Middle. I'm a PhD student at the Open University in the UK, and I'm giving this talk as part of the Linked Open Data and the User Experience Design and Analysis strands of the Digital Humanities 2020 virtual conference. My PhD looks at how linked data technologies might best be integrated with ancient world research methods, and this talk will focus on my findings with regard to improving the user experience of linked ancient world data tools and resources, in order that they might be opened up to a wider audience. In this presentation, I'll start with some background information before giving an overview of my methodology, and then I'll share some of the findings from my user research with a view to addressing the following questions. How are linked ancient world data tools and resources experienced by end users, and how might they be made more accessible to a wider public? Linked data technologies can be used to bring together digital objects and datasets from multiple different sources by making connections based on features that they have in common. Implementing linked data technologies can be hugely powerful for resource discoverability through cross-collection search platforms. It also has the potential to reveal new relationships between objects held in different collections and allows more sophisticated queries, so it should facilitate the research process. However, from a data producer's perspective, linked data technologies can be complex and time-consuming to implement, which often means that this complexity is replicated in any user interfaces they produce. In other cases, there is too much reliance on the assumption that having a rich data structure is sufficient, with little consideration of how users might be guided through their interaction with this data. So, even though the data is technically open, any kind of meaningful access to it is often restricted to a small, technically skilled subset of users. In my research, I'm looking specifically at the ancient world, which can be considered a microcosm of the humanities, incorporating lots of different disciplines, and for which there are already a number of relatively mature linked data tools and resources. My aims are to identify which linked data tools and resources are used most frequently, explore users' experiences of these resources, and recommend how they might attract a wider audience. I decided to combine breadth and depth by conducting a survey and then interviewing a sample of participants. Assuming that few ancient world researchers have used linked data, but that many could benefit from it, I aimed the survey at all ancient world researchers who use digital tools and resources, intending to apply more generic findings to linked data specifically. 212 participants responded, who were predominantly associated with universities, so academics, researchers or students, aged between 25 and 44, and located in the UK, the US or Germany, although 32 countries were represented. And there were slightly more women than men, with a small proportion who preferred not to provide their gender or to self-describe. I selected an interview sample of 17, ensuring differing levels of technical experience while being broadly demographically representative of the survey population. I found from the survey that 23% of participants had knowingly used linked data at some point. And these participants were presented with a set of follow-up questions about the linked data tool or resource with which they're most familiar. The most frequently mentioned tools or resources in this section were Pelagios, which comprises tools for creating and exploring linked ancient world data, largely based on geography; Pleiades, which provides persistent identifiers for ancient places; and papyri.info, which provides search and editing tools for combined collections of papyri. Features of these resources that participants particularly appreciated included accessing multiple data sources from a single point, advanced search features, and viewing connections between related entities. Looking more broadly at responses to questions about digital resources in general, similar features were valued by the majority of survey participants. So even participants with limited technical experience showed an interest in combining multiple resources and incorporating advanced query options to improve efficiency of discovery. And these results demonstrate that linked data resources clearly have a broad potential appeal and can benefit ancient world researchers without a technical background. Although there were many positive comments about the user experience of these particular resources, several participants identified barriers which made their experience a bit more difficult. In the following slides, I'll outline my main recommendations for how these barriers might be addressed. My first recommendation is to develop an interface with as few barriers to entry as possible. In both the survey and interviews, whether participants were discussing linked data resources in particular or digital resources in general, user interfaces were a key factor in determining whether or not a participant started and continued to use a tool or resource. When considering their experiences, many participants valued simple interfaces which do not assume any specific technical knowledge on the part of the user and which provide a gentle introduction to the tool or resource, rather than bombarding the user with details of all its functionality up front. Implementing a simple but effective interface involves careful consideration of how a user might interact with the tool or resource, including how and where to signpost particular features or information sources. My second recommendation complements the idea of a simple interface and is to introduce users to the tool or resource by providing access to curated collections. And this was something that was also found in a survey by Europeana Cloud in 2015. Human curated content gives users a clear starting point for their interaction with the resource and highlights potential objects of interest, while illustrating the type of content they might be able to discover through their own searches. And this recommendation comes in response to several comments from participants that it was sometimes unclear where to start when first encountering a particular tool or resource, as well as suggestions that incorporating curated content might be a potential solution. My third and final recommendation continues the theme of intervention by the tool or resource producers in the user's experience by making sure to incorporate clear documentation. During the interviews, the topic of documentation came up a lot in our discussions, and I found that although clear documentation was appreciated, less technically experienced participants were unlikely to consult tool and resource documentation at all, due to an assumption that it would be too complex to understand. So, brief instructions at key points in the user journey might be more effective in communicating how users might be able to get the most out of a tool or resource. And these can then be supplemented with links to longer explanations that incorporate more technical detail, as well as case studies to demonstrate how the tool or resource has been used in previous projects and how it might assist with specific tasks or research purposes. Language should be clear throughout and should not make assumptions about the researcher's technical knowledge or their familiarity with jargon. In this study, I have found that linked data tools and resources can be extremely useful for ancient world researchers and were already used by nearly a quarter of my research participants. Although participants' experiences tended to be positive, there were some common barriers they experienced, potentially the result of having resource producers assuming that having a rich semantic structure would allow the data to speak for itself, and that making data open automatically results in that data's accessibility. My research has found that human intervention is key to making linked ancient world data resources accessible to a wider public. And the three measures that can be taken include implementing a simple user interface with minimal barriers to entry, curating content to provide a starting point for new users, and improving clarity and placement of documentation. Although any updates to a digital tool or resource require an investment of time and funds, the second and third actions would be less costly than redesigning a user interface and could potentially be as effective in broadening the potential audience. I specifically focused on linked data in my study, but these recommendations could equally apply to resources that employ a different technological approach. Now, as I said at the beginning, this work forms part of my wider PhD study into how linked data might be most effectively integrated with ancient world research methodologies. I'm currently in the process of writing up my findings and would be very interested to hear questions and comments at this stage. Here's my list of references. I'll just leave this up for a couple of seconds so you can pause if there are any that you'd like to follow up. And thank you very much for listening. For DH 2020 attendees, I'll see you over on Humanities Commons.